Hey, gun people. All right, we're back with George Floyd and this pathologist. Man, she's been on for freaking ever. I keep fast forwarding trying to figure out when the defense is coming on, and I finally found it. But I caught her last question. Bad move by the prosecution. He ended on a poor question and didn't get the answer he wanted. So I wanted to cover this right before we go into, because right after this question, she starts getting her cross, and that's kind of when I went. But she was on for a long, long time, and when you keep a kind of expert witness that talks about something that they know for this long, the odds of you losing, boring, or the jury tuning you out is high. So, I mean, if you can't get a witness on there and make your points, but the DA interviewing her kind of rambles. He kind of goes on, just like he does in these last two questions. The last two questions, he doesn't know the answer, and he doesn't get the answer he expects. But he's done, and he leaves it at that. Not good. He'll be coming back to clean up this mess that he left. But let's hear it.
Do you know if any of the studies actually measured the decrease in lung volumes as part of the study, that is, decrease in oxygen reserves?
Not that I know of, no.
So any relevance to George Floyd at all?
Not in my opinion, no.
Now, I want to say before I forget, this I didn't see the rest of her testimony. From what I saw in this last answer, she gained credibility with me. She tried to qualify it a little bit by saying, I wouldn't want to be in that position, but she didn't give him the answer she knew he wanted, which to me gives her credibility.
So, Dr. Thomas, have you done any calculations or kind of work of your own to measure what the subdual and the restraint with the knee on the neck and the back of George Floyd would have done to his oxygen reserves or lung capacities?
No, that would be something I would completely defer to a pulmonary doctor to address.
Okay, so he was trying to end on that good note, and when that one failed, he tries another one.
So then are you able to tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if you haven't done that work, whether the forces that Mr. Floyd was subjected to would have even killed a normal, healthy person?
In the way you phrased that, not based on lung volume and that kind of study. I mean, from watching the video, I certainly wouldn't want to be in that position, but that's a different answer.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. No further questions.
So he ended on an answer that he really didn't want and he didn't expect. So she should have just said, no, I can't say that. But she kind of beat around a bush a little bit, but she didn't give him the answer that she knew he was looking for. So she gains a little credibility, but I still think she's biased because she kind of tried to justify it and I wouldn't want to be there. She gave a whole bunch of shit that he didn't ask. But anyway, let's get to the cross.
You described being a forensic pathologist as sort of being the doctor's doctor, right?
General pathologist is considered that, yes.
Right. And the forensic pathologist, in terms of a death investigation, you kind of have to wear many hats, right?
Yes.
You have to have a broad familiarity with multiple medical conditions, right?
Yes.
And sometimes medical conditions may appear at autopsy that you've never seen before.
Yes.
Right? Some strange disease that you've never seen, right?
Yes.
Now, he does this a lot, and I've kind of picked this up as I'm watching him. He'll ask a question, he'll get the answer he wants, and then he goes in for a second bite at the apple, and sometimes he blows it. Instead of, I got her to say that I don't do this, and then he wants to give an example, kind of like blah, blah, and then if he gives a bad example, they get to say no, and he blows his first response, which I say his first win, and he blows it because he comes in for a second bite. And he's done that a few times. I've noticed a trend with him.
And you will speak to other doctors, right?
Yes.
You will gather information and share that. They'll share information with you to help you make conclusions in an autopsy, right?
Yes.
And you also described how being a medical examiner is more than just the autopsy, right?
Yes.
The autopsy is one small part of a death investigation, right?
Yes.
You described reviewing videotapes in certain circumstances, right?
Yes.
Past medical records, right?
Yes.
Interviews with friends, family members.
So a little bit of this kind of questioning here is, I don't want to make my time so short in front of the jury that I get done too quick, because then the jury will remember that she's been on here for the last 2 hours or however long she was on there. And I want to put some distance in that, what they heard from her and when she's talking to me. So I'm going to try to get her to repeat some of her stuff, which I don't really think he should be doing, but he wants to go over her testimony, kind of like to lock her down, and that gives him leeway to maybe think of a question when he's going over this in case he wasn't able to write it down, or he gets her comfortable to where he starts dinging her a little bit later and it doesn't look like he jumped up there and just attacked her. So these are all tactical decisions that DAs and prosecutors, defense attorneys make when they're interviewing in front of juries. You got to, in front of a judge, it's not that important. Judge trials usually go a lot quicker than juries because the attorneys can just say what they want. The judge knows, they don't have to explain it. They boom, 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 and it's a lot quicker. So you don't have this, I got to be careful. I don't want to piss off the jury. I got to be slow. I don't want to make the witness. I don't want to look like a jerk. So, you know, you got these 12 people that don't know the law. So there's much more of an education, and it takes a lot longer to do that social juggling that I don't want to piss somebody off. So that's sort of why I know some of the comments are like some of the attorneys kind of ramble and go on, but that's kind of what's going on behind the scene.
People who knew the decedent, right?
Yes.
And me as a witness, I got up there. I didn't give a shit if it was a jury or a judge. I am who I am. I testified and I answered. I wouldn't say anything if it was a judge or if it was a jury. I'd say the same damn thing. I didn't care. And some jurors like that. Some jurors didn't. Some jurors saw me as cocky or arrogant. Others saw me as confident, well-articulated, blah, blah, blah. Because when juries are finished, attorneys will give them an envelope and say, would you mind filling this out about what you think about me or any of the witnesses? And when they comment on a witness, the DA usually gets back that witness, goes, hey, man, the jury said this about you, or the jury said that about you.
Ultimately, the medical examiner's office compiles a massive, amount of information itself about the cause and manner of death, right?
Yes.
And you've had an opportunity to review a lot of that information in this case, correct?
Yes.
Now, have you reviewed all of the interviews of witnesses?
Probably not all of them, no.
Okay. Have you, after you prepared your report, have you been provided with additional materials that may be relevant to your considerations?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay. And we'll come back to that. So I just kind of want to, but you did have an opportunity to review Dr. Baker's entire file.
Yes.
Right? And I believe we'll be hearing from Dr. Baker later this morning or this afternoon, but we'll have some questions for him. I would like to follow up on some of your conclusions. There's a term used in Dr. Baker's autopsy, the cause of death, the term complicating.
Yes.
Can you define, medically speaking, what the term complicating means?
Oh, I guess it could be used in lots of different ways. The way I would think of it in this setting is both things were present, that there was a cardiopulmonary arrest and that it was due to law enforcement, subdual restraint, and compression. I guess that's how I would consider it in this setting.
So when you say it was caused by law enforcement, you're saying that none of the medical conditions or poly drug use affected or could have had any effect on his death.
Have you been provided with Dr. Baker's, any information about Dr. Baker's opinions in this case?
Nothing very specific. I mean, just what he put in the autopsy report and all of his conclusions.
So in terms of the word complicating, it's capable of different definitions based upon the forensic pathologist, right?
Yes.
Right. And so you, as a forensic pathologist, may have a different interpretation of what complicating means compared to Dr. Baker, for example.
Yes.
And there's a reasonable degree of disagreement amongst, in any case generally, it's reasonable for doctors to disagree with each other, is it not?
That sometimes happens, yes.
All right. You did not perform the...
She's not really answering. She's kind of qualifying. See, when the prosecution asks, and again, I don't know on this witness, but you want a witness to go, look, if I'm going to explain it to the prosecution, I'm going to explain it to you. But if he asks me yes or no and I answer yes, but you ask me yes or no and I go, well, that sometimes can happen. That when you start losing credibility. I'm not saying she lost it on that one answer, but we'll see.
The actual autopsy of Mr. Floyd, correct?
Correct.
And that was Dr. Baker who did that, right?
Yes.
And you know Dr. Baker well?
Yes.
And you know him to be a competent medical examiner?
Yes.
Right. He's the chief medical examiner for Hennepin County at this time?
Yes.
Now, you were provided again with all of the information from his report, and I would like to go through a few of the things with you. Let's talk about...
I thought she said she didn't have all the information. Did I miss that? She kind of said both. She goes, not really, but I got his report and all the attachments. I don't know what else there is, but...
About Mr. Floyd's heart first.
Okay.
What was the size of Mr. Floyd's heart as measured at autopsy?
The weight of Mr. Floyd's heart was 540 grams.
And would you explain, or would you describe that as an enlarged heart?
I would say it's a slightly enlarged heart, yes.
Slightly enlarged. I'd pin her down on that because it sounds like she's just qualifying it. What's the normal? Why is his bigger? What's the biggest you've ever seen? I would explore that.
And there are some different measures of how to base an enlarged heart, or how to determine if a heart is enlarged, right?
Right. By some categories, that heart would not be considered enlarged.
So
she volunteered that. I wonder if she volunteered in some categories, it would be really enlarged, and she didn't volunteer that.
There's two, as I understand it, two different kind of primary measurements, or primary ways of comparing Mr. Floyd's heart to determine if it's enlarged, right? The Molina studies and the Northwestern studies.
Oh, I see. There's probably multiple ways of looking at heart weights. I mean, those are two of them. There's the study from the Mayo Clinic. There's one in Europe. There's lots of ways of analyzing.
But ultimately, based on all of your information, you would agree that Mr. Floyd's heart was slightly enlarged, right?
Yes.
Why not ask her which measure she used? And does she know which one the doctor used? I mean, if there's multiple ways to do it, which one did you use?
In terms of the DeMaio and Molina standard, what would a normal male heart weigh for a person similar to Mr. Floyd?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head.
Would you disagree if I said it was 383 grams?
That well could be.
See, I already forgot what she said his was, and it sounds like she's going to jump in here and add something else. Again, when she starts adding and he ain't asking, she's got an agenda.
Well could be. For the average, I mean.
For the average, right.
Yeah.
So according to, if that were the average heart rate, or heart size, excuse me, heart weight, 383 grams, relevant to Mr. Floyd's heart, Mr. Floyd's heart would be considered profoundly enlarged.
Well, the thing about using averages in, especially medicine, which is of course what I'm most familiar with, is we don't generally just compare it to an average. We usually compare it to an average plus or minus 2 standard deviations. So that's why the range that I usually use is, from 253 to 510 grams would be the range of normal for someone of Mr. Floyd's height.
250 to 500? That's a big freaking leeway.
And so I don't
That doesn't sound very specific to me.
know in the DeMaio Molina study what their 2 standard deviations would be.
Okay.
But I wouldn't use just the average.
Okay, and so in terms of how you would assess the weight or size of the heart, you would say 510 grams is the high, 510 grams is the high end
Right.
of that, and 540 exceeds that, right?
Right.
And so in terms of whether it's a very enlarged heart or even a relatively minimally enlarged heart, a larger heart requires more blood, right?
Yes. It has greater demand, yes.
What are some of the things that cause a person to have an enlarged heart?
Probably the primary cause is high blood pressure.
And you understand, based on Mr. Floyd's medical records, that he did in fact have a history of high blood pressure, correct?
Yes.
Can you describe the blood vessels of the heart?
There are several major coronary arteries that's, as I mentioned, supply blood and nutrients to the heart muscle. There's the left and right, and then the left branches into the left anterior descending and the left circumflex, and then there's some other branches off that.
And how would you describe narrowing or stenosis of the coronary arteries?
So the way we as forensic pathologists describe it is we look at the opening. So if an opening is fully open, then that would be 0% narrowing. And if it's completely closed, then that would be 100% occluded. And so then we look at anything ranging from, 25, 50, 75, 90%. Obviously, it's just an eyeball estimation. We don't actually get out calipers and measure because the actual percentage doesn't really matter. It's more, did they have coronary artery disease? Was it pretty good, pretty bad? That sort of thing.
Can you describe the difference between proximal and distal narrowing?
The way the coronary arteries supply blood to the heart, they come off of the aorta, which is the main vessel that takes blood from the heart to the rest of the body. And so in close to the aorta is called proximal to the aorta, and then the further out it goes distributing blood along the way to the heart muscle is called distal.
And when you have proximal narrowing, how does that affect the heart?
It can narrow the blood supply to more of the heart than if you have distal narrowing.
Another way of saying that would be it decreases the amount of blood the heart is getting, right?
Yes.
And it also affects how things are removed from the heart, right? Like CO2, carbon dioxide.
Well, that's different. That wouldn't happen from the blood vessels coming in, I don't think. So I wouldn't include carbon dioxide in that.
Is there a standard within forensic pathology where pathologists would consider to be that there's enough of a narrowing to cause sudden death?
So the way I would describe that is anything over more than 70 to 75% is, in the view of a forensic pathologist, something that, in the absence of another cause of death, could be used to explain death. Now, it's also true that people live with 100% occlusion and go on and do fine. So you have to understand this is strictly my perspective as a forensic pathologist, and everyone I see is dead. So that's kind of a different perspective.
Can you just explain what myocyte necrosis is?
The myocyte is the name of the heart muscle cell. So cyte means cell, it's C-Y-T-E, and myo means muscle. So when you have a heart myocyte, it's the heart muscle cell, and necrosis means death. So if you see myocyte necrosis, that means there are dead heart muscle cells.
And do you have to have myocyte necrosis to cause sudden death?
No, you don't have to have myocyte necrosis.
And would you say that hypoxia is the absence of oxygen? Agreed?
Yes.
And can hypoxia of the heart cause sudden death by other means?
Hypoxia means low oxygen, sorry. And your question is, can low oxygen to the heart cause sudden death through an arrhythmia? I presume, yes.
Okay. What would you, how would you describe the conduction system of the heart?
The way the heart beats, the lub-dub, is that there are electrical currents that go through the heart muscle. And normally there's a certain sequence in which the heart muscles will fire. And that's called the conduction system, through which the electrical impulses flow. And that's what keeps the heart beating in a regular rhythm, that beat, beat, beat. And yeah, that's the conduction system.
So what happens if the conduction system is impaired?
Then you can get what's called an arrhythmia, or abnormal beating of the heart.
And that can result in sudden death?
It can, yes.
Which artery supplies that kind of like that pacemaker of the heart?
Oh, it probably is variable from person to person. I mean, I think the coronary artery that we consider the most important usually is the left anterior descending coronary artery, but there's a lot of individual variability.
Can you, what about the right coronary artery?
It really depends on any given person, which part of the heart is supplied by their particular distribution.
Okay. And in Mr. Floyd's autopsy, the right coronary artery, Dr. Baker determined had a 90% occlusion, correct?
90% narrowing, yes.
When someone is exerting themselves, does that make the heart work harder?
Yes.
Does that mean that more blood, oxygen, it needs more blood to function? The heart needs more blood to function at that time?
Yes.
It's kind of like when we think about exerting anything like jogging, running, the heart needs more blood and hence more oxygen in order to function properly, right?
Yes.
You also described the fight or flight kind of the physiology of that in your consideration, right?
Yes, the physiological stress. Mm-hmm.
And the physiological stress produces adrenaline, right?
Yes.
And that also causes the heart to work harder?
Yes.
And therefore need more blood?
Yes.
And more oxygen?
Yes.
So let me ask you this. In this particular case, right, we have a heart that is at least above average, right, needing more blood. We have a heart with a occluded right coronary artery, right?
Narrowed.
Narrowed.
Mm-hmm.
We have a heart that the left anterior descending artery also had a 75% narrowing, right?
Yes.
And so you have, and then you have an exertion of stress producing adrenaline, right?
Yes.
So the heart has to work very, very hard in this case. Fair to
Yes.
say? Let's take the police out of this, and I'm going to ask you a hypothetical. Let's assume you found Mr. Floyd dead in his residence, no police involvement, no drugs, right? The only thing you found would be these facts about his heart. What would you conclude to be the cause of death?
In that very narrow set of circumstances, I would probably conclude that the cause of death was his heart disease.
So have you, as a forensic pathologist, ever certified a death due to arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease,
Probably thousands of times, yes.
with similar degrees of narrowing of the arteries?
Yes.
Have you ever certified a death due to hypertensive cardiomegaly? I'm trying to...
Yes, hypertensive cardiovascular disease, yes, absolutely.
With a heart at this weight or even smaller?
Well, if it was, again, in this setting where that was the only abnormal finding, then I would probably go with that, yes.
So one of the things that has to be considered in this particular case is Mr. Floyd's heart, right?
Yes.
And even without any sort of an exertion, again, take the exertion out of it, take the police out of it, take the drugs out of it, that's a potential cause of death that needs to be considered.
Yes.
Now, you discussed the abrasions that you saw and the jury saw pictures of. You would agree that the abrasions are in a left to right pattern?
Meaning there are more on the left than on the right?
Right.
On his face, yes. On his shoulder, yes. And then he had the abrasions on his right hand.
And even in terms of the pattern of the abrasion, there's up and down an abrasion could go from the bottom of my body up, or it could go from left to right, right?
Yes. I guess I didn't really focus on what direction the abrasions were going in that sense.
Okay, and that's fine. But you would agree that one possible way that at least some of these abrasions occurred would be when Mr. Floyd was initially put down on the ground.
I guess they could, yes.
Right. And not all of those abrasions necessarily occurred while Mr. Floyd was in the prone position, right?
Man, this is a hard question.
That's hard to answer,
Right.
I would say.
It's
Well, is it possible? I mean, just is it possible that he got the abrasions when we put him down or when he was on the ground? We don't know for sure. Reasonable doubt.
hard to answer when the abrasions were there and
Right.
what caused the abrasions, right?
Right, right.
And if someone was being held down with the weight of 3 people, would you expect those to be more punctile in their nature, or abrade, like with the lines and movements?
Oh, gosh, there are too many variables there, I would say.
Okay. Now, you ultimately determined that this case was an asphyxiation, essentially, right?
Yes, that was the primary mechanism.
Right. And asphyxiation is simply the lack of oxygen to the brain,
Yeah, low oxygen, inadequate oxygen.
inadequate oxygen to the brain specifically.
Yes.
And in terms of asphyxiation, you would agree that there are multiple things that can cause asphyxiation.
Yes.
So you use the reference to someone being strangled, right?
Yes.
So if I came up to you and I strangled, or I strangled a person, put my hands around their neck, there are certain things that you would expect to see, right?
Sometimes you do, yes. And that's great when you do. You don't always, but
And those would be things like a broken hyoid bone,
yeah,
right? The petechial hemorrhaging that you discussed.
yes.
And in an asphyxia death, there are frequently, those types of signs available, right?
Well, it really depends on the mechanism of asphyxia.
Okay, so let's go back to the mechanisms of asphyxia. You described it. Strangling would be one.
Yeah.
Hanging could be one.
Yes.
Right. You've described positional or mechanical asphyxia.
Those are types, yes.
Yeah. Positional being, based on the position of the.
Ask her to name all the different types. He's trying to name them and then narrow down. Let her name them, then you pick which one you want to make the example out of after she names it.
Body. Mechanical being using some sort of a device to asphyxiate someone.
Oh, well, we haven't really talked a lot about positional and mechanical. I mean, there's all kinds of things under both of those that can cause low oxygen.
And one of the things that can cause a low oxygen to the brain is the use of controlled substances, correct?
Well,
I can't believe she even has to pause on that. Of course it can.
eventually, yes. Yes.
So someone can ingest a particular type of a controlled substance. That particular substance could affect the diaphragm, right?
It affects some controlled substances affect the ability to breathe, which then decreases the oxygen, which then leads to low oxygen. Yes.
Right. And that's essentially what you're saying is that there, in this particular case, as I understand it with my notes, is that essentially what happens is there was some event that happened that resulted in a decrease of oxygen to the brain, and that resulted in death.
Yes.
And that's essentially what asphyxia is generally.
Inadequate oxygen. Yes.
Right. Okay. And you were asked a series of questions about some studies in terms of, I think they're called they're out of San Diego. Or,
Yes, Dr. Chan. and
Dr.
his
Chan's,
group.
right. Yep. Are you familiar with the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine?
Yes.
Now, you testified that some of the problems with the Chan studies were that they were in laboratory settings. Sorry, laboratory settings, that they were controlled environments, healthy individuals, etc. Right?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the work of Dr. Christine Hall and her paper "Incidence and Outcome of Prone Positioning Following Police Use of Force in a Prospective Consecutive Cohort of Subjects"?
Is that the one from Canada?
Yes.
Yes.
And that was essentially an analysis of actual police encounters, correct?
Yes. In Canada.
In Canada, understood. But they actually, that study, they go through and they look at the number of police-citizen interactions, correct?
Yes.
And then from those police-citizen interactions, they further go in to look at how many involved being placed in the prone position board, whether the length of time to a certain extent that someone was in the prone position. Agreed?
Yes.
And ultimately, they analyzed about 3,000 prone positional placements
Yes.
out of a total of like 1.1 million police interactions.
Yes.
So 1.1 million police interactions, resulting in about 3,000 prone position arrests. That those these are real people, real incidents, right?
Yeah.
And in those 3,000 or so interactions, there were no deaths that occurred.
Isn't that amazing? When you consider that virtually every forensic pathologist in the United States has probably had an officer-involved death like this. How did they, it utterly baffles me, which is why I kept saying Canada, because I think, I don't know what's different, but
You know, Jack,
that,
this time is not
sorry.
responsive. So the
That was so freaking subliminal that our cops are out of control and cops are mean. Had nothing to do whatsoever with the question, and she threw in a personal opinion. Isn't that amazing that all those cops used force and nobody died? And I mean, that was, she got it in. You can't unring that bell. The jury heard that. Now, the judge said strike it, but man, I'm going to end this at 33 and we'll come back to her.